Jemen korsan och tvärsan och har studerat arabiska i Sanaa, arabiska and history i Sanaa i ett år.
Ottoman Empire.
Och i Sanaa och studerat om det ottomanska imperiet. Så att det är verkligen har skrivit 2 böcker om Jemen. Det är en källa till kunskap, och det är kunskap som vi behöver för oss att kunna aktivera oss i denna fråga.
Because English is not our preferred language. I'm sorry, I have not had the good fortune of studying Swedish. It is not the international language that it once was, with Ingvar Bergman at the helm. But I will start just by highlighting that I've been at this for a long time. Yemen has been a basket case in all the right ways for me. It's been a place of passion, of great personal investment. I find the resilience of people from Yemen extraordinary. I noticed already in 1992, when I first arrived there as a young man, to travel into a newly unified country, that it seemed that it was getting itself out of a very deep hole that I would learn later on was in many ways the product of Yemen's unfortunate interactions with the larger world. A larger world that had been, over the course of the 20th century, increasingly dominated by sets of financial interests, using Yemen's most immediate neighbors as its primary tool of influence in the region. So by 1992, a unified Yemen, which was something that was overwhelmingly supported by its population, became the #1 security concern for some of these imperialist assets in the larger region. And I'm speaking, of course, of Saudi Arabia in particular. And the campaign to undermine Yemen's resilience, which had extended back to the 1920s in regards to North Yemen, would continue in different forms by the mid-1990s, using what was basically, since the 1980s, Takfiri, I would say fundamentalist Sunni Islam, first in Afghanistan, or most famously in Afghanistan, but it played itself out in other parts of the Middle East in the 1980s as well. And it really became, I think, the most obvious tool of empire in the case of Yemen. I won't be able to share that with much detail here, but I've written 2 books. The latest one called Destroying Yemen, What Chaos in Arabia Tells Us About the Larger World. It's with the University of California Press. And my goal is to explain why does Yemen have to be destroyed, why it has been the target of empire. Now it extends, I argue, back to the beginning of the 20th century, but I cannot go back that far for this presentation. I will start with around the year 2000, and I'll explain why that's an important day. But quickly, this is the context of the Arabian Peninsula politically from around 1902 to the 1920s. As you can see from this map, each color representing a different polity. It was at one point in time recognized as a sovereign state by various local powers or larger global powers, whether it be the Italians, the Soviet Union, the French, the British, Americans, etc. So as you can see, the Arabian Peninsula was very much up for grabs, if you will, politically speaking, economically speaking. It was something that was not set in stone that we would have a consolidated Saudi state under a ruling family whose role under the British and then American alliance, I think, is self-evident for those of you in this room. As you can see, with the entire southern part of the Arabian Peninsula, very dynamic setting in which a number of different polities were operating at certain points of time. To a large extent, the most complicated part, what we would call South Yemen, was very much a negotiated, constantly transforming political space in which the British were forced to constantly adapt to local conditions. We have in that orange area in the southwest of the Arabian Peninsula what would be basically North Yemen, the Imamate of North Yemen. And the areas to its, I wish I could, maybe I should walk up. I don't know if you're familiar or not with these areas would be periodically occupied by both the British and their Saudi allies up until 1934, and this area would become more or less a de facto border between the expanding kingdom of Saudi Arabia, which again received weapons, arms, and logistical support from the British first, and then from the 1940s onwards, Aramco, the oil company, the American oil company, conglomerate, and the United States government. And at some point in 1934, Saudi Arabia became an occupying power of a large section of northern Yemen. And this is an important part of the larger story today. So at this moment, we are now well over 1,000 days of war, of regular bombing of heavily populated areas, an extensive campaign of destroying infrastructure in the north part of Yemen in particular, which includes bridges, of course, roads, which is a very mountainous country, very difficult to travel, but more importantly and more sinister, destruction of water systems, delivery systems, factories that process food. Yemen had long been self-sufficient in food until the 1970s when various UN agencies and the United States aid agencies pushed Yemen to be a net exporter of cash crops and a net importer of cheaper food from abroad, primarily American donated wheat, a classic tactic that the Americans have used throughout the world. So Yemen, by the time of the war, 2015, was importing 90% of its food. So with the embargo on Yemen, which has been more or less consistent from March of 2015 onwards, the active attempts to destroy the capacity of local fisheries, for instance, to continuously process fish, destruction of fishing fleets on the coastline, the destruction of dairy farms, chicken farms, the use of cluster bombs in fields, so what remains of fields that could be cultivated have also been unusable. The spraying of chemicals on areas which are actually used, much like what Israel does with Gaza Strip these days. We have a situation in which upwards of 18 to 20 million people who are still living in the north are exposed to ongoing threat of starvation. We have no way of counting how many people have died of starvation already. We have no way of counting, and the UN refuses to adjust the numbers to explain who is actually the most vulnerable at this stage. But the problem with this war, as it moves forward, and we clearly understand that there is a concerted effort to keep Yemen off the agenda, keep Yemen out of the media, to keep this catastrophe of a scale of upwards of 20 million people vulnerable to starvation, is in large part because of the kind of language. It can actually be excused as a simple kind of continuation or extension of a war that has persisted throughout the larger region. And I'm referring to now the simplistic binary between sectarian groups, Shia Muslims against Sunni Muslims. This is the narrative that plays itself out continuously to explain for why violence persists in the larger Middle East. In the case of Yemen, a group that is associated with an individual who became enemy number one of certain interested parties in the 1990s, became an affiliated group to this spiritual figure. They call them now Houthis, have been erroneously, manipulatively attached with this larger narrative about Shia versus Sunni. So the so-called Houthis, which in itself is a problem as a term, nevertheless is being used in this larger regional context, Shia versus Sunnis. It helps explain for an audience who may be interested in why 18 million people may be facing starvation, why over 1 million people are now infected with cholera, that, well, it's all about these ancient hatreds. A kind of classic kind of phrase that has been used regarding the Middle East and the Balkans since the 1990s at least. So when journalists don't visit the regions, and when they report from Beirut, or when they report from Cairo, from Riyadh, they will use these phrases. It will be it's a readily packaged narrative about Yemen. It is a long structural problem dealing with an embedded sectarianism that exists in the region. So it's a matter of selling the war by not talking about the war, or reducing the war to a simple kind of narrative, which is about Sunnis and Shia, as opposed to what are actually the underlying factors for why individual countries have invested in destroying Yemen. I can't illuminate and discuss all of the factors that are at play. I'm going to decide to highlight several key components to this story about Yemen, and why the destruction of Yemen, a unified Yemen, and the destruction of a North Yemen in particular, is of strategic interest to a certain number of powers or interests. And that will be primarily Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, the United States and Britain, who are the primary beneficiaries of this war. And I'll explain now why we need to differentiate between those actors in this so-called coalition in the war that has started in March 2015, under the aegis of the United Nations, 2216. It is marketed that the war is a necessary move by regional actors to respond to a local conflict, to a civil war. You'll often hear it referred to as a civil war, which in itself is a very manipulative, reductive framing of this war. This is a war of aggression by outside powers. This is not a war pitting Yemenis against each other. There are certainly factions fighting and killing each other, but to frame it in this way, in many ways, disguises the actual aggressive dynamics of this war. Very much similar to Syria and Iraq. Right? You have conflicts in many parts of the world that are explained in terms that are meant to actually confuse our ability to analyze what actually takes place on the ground. So this is a war of aggression by outside parties. It's a civil war, as in the mainstream narrative about it, that pits Shia versus Sunni. And I can't get into the details why these categories, why Shia and Zaydism, which is under the northwest part of Yemen, where people professes a certain kind of association with Islam and interpretation of legal tradition. It is certainly not related to the Twelver Shiism of Iran. Indeed, links between Iran and this part of Yemen has more or less been non-existent. And today, for sure, the narrative does not apply. And I can explain maybe in the question and answer and elaborate more if you need. But I need to now move forward with this kind of pushback on this language of sectarianism, because, again, it's used as a simple kind of way of explaining for much of the larger regional problems. It justifies, without having to explain any further, why neighboring states like Saudi Arabia aggressively position and use power, and often use radical takfiri groups to pursue their interests, whether it be in Syria, Iraq, or in Yemen. In many ways, it basically disguises what are some of the other more important strategic concerns that members of the GCC countries and their main, let's say, imperial benefactor, United States / UK, are up to. Do we know what GCC means? The Gulf Cooperation Council. It's something that was created in the 1980s that brought the oil-rich countries of the Arabian Peninsula. At some point, Yemen may have been invited to join. It is a very loose coalition that is, again, fraught with internal rivalries. We've seen it played itself out recently with Qatar being isolated and blamed for much of the problems in the larger region. The United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia on paper today is presented in public as allies in this conflict with Qatar. But as I will demonstrate with the case of Yemen, it's quite clear that in fact Abu Dhabi and Riyadh are have very different sets of interests and are actually competitors in this larger regional dynamic. And it plays itself out in a very horrible way in Yemen. So while we in this part of the world are encouraged to think about this as a conflict that pits Shias against Sunnis, pits a legitimate government against a rebellious, non-compliant Shia minority, it's often the assumption is that the so-called Houthis are not representative of anything more than a small group of tribal peoples of a certain part of Yemen. I will argue that what the picture suggests on the left, which is a scene from Sana'a, since the bombing campaign started, as opposed to the so-called representative and legitimate president of Yemen, who sits more or less comfortably in Riyadh since he escaped arrest in April of 2015, there's a huge difference of perspective, and we are never allowed to actually to consult with those who amass by millions sometimes in protest on the streets of Sana'a or in Taiz or elsewhere in North Yemen, and are expected to look at Yemen through the perspective very neatly laid out in Riyadh. And I think this is a good way to juxtapose what is some of the problems we have with the reporting on Yemen, to how we understand regional politics more generally. While we would like to think that we have certain kinds of advantageous perspectives by the kind of reporting we get from journalists, again, it's a very controlled environment. It's a very controlled media environment. And unfortunately, even amongst my academic colleagues, the reference is always through the perspective on the right. You will never have even scholars make reference to the mass politics of North Yemen today. So this justifiable war, which is, again, through institutions that have a global kind of resonance, through the United Nations Security Council resolutions, through mass media campaigns to tailor this as a conflict that is internal between Shia and Sunni. We have the language of a legitimate government versus a rebellious, tribal, backward Shia Iranian proxies. We have a war that then is basically justified. It's a justified intervention. It's an international coalition of legitimate powers trying to bring back law and order to an otherwise unstable and dangerous regional conflict or local conflict. And the consequences are the destruction of, again, cities, the untold, uncounted, and we will never know how many civilians have died in this conflict. It is actively a point of suppression, this kinds of information. You will rarely see these images of civilians dead showing up in mainstream media. Certainly not from AFP or Reuters, or indeed they will never provide this imagery. So my question is, what is actually going on if it's not an issue of Iran versus Saudi Arabia, if it's not an issue between Shia and Sunni, if it is not a question of legitimacy or not, and if it's not a civil war, what is actually going on in Yemen? It is a conflict that has much deeper roots. In my books, my two books on contemporary Yemen, I have provided extensive historical kind of grounding to why we need to understand these conflicts in different ways that are much more narrow. One example is this category Houthis, which is, I'm not quite sure how Swedish media treats the conflict in Yemen, if it does at all, but I'm pretty sure that they will use, in a clumsy, unexplained way, Houthis as a reference to the opponents in this conflict. The Houthis are against the rest of the world, basically. And of course never lionized in the potential of saying, you know, it's the small guy fighting the big guy, it's the puppets of Iran. This is the way Iran has a way of gaining access and influence in a strategic area. They'll never explain why it's a strategic area. They'll just say that the presence of Iranian proxies constitutes a danger. They never explain to you why it's a danger. They never explain to you why Yemen is strategically important, other than its possibility that it guards the entry into the Red Sea. But I'll explain to you why it's important. I actually do not explain why it's strategically important. But the key here is that the Houthi becomes the kind of unexplained term that gives you an easy and accessible problem. It's personalized often with pictures of the depictions of Yemenis from the north who are eating cats, who have seemingly threatening local clothing, most likely with a Kalashnikov in their hand, classic Orientalist depictions of backward people who need to be in some way civilized by the UN resolution of some sort, and of course a coalition. Oh, by the way, my preference is to actually see those participants who may be associated in the West as simply Houthis, and actually speak of them in this much broader term, Ansar Allah, or Party of God, who are actually a broad coalition that represent and extend well beyond geographically what would be traditionally considered Houthi strong area. So I will be referring now, from now on, to Ansar Allah as the coalition of those who have actually intervened and initiated this process of conflict that now is in its third year. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a second. First of all, we need to put the conflict, the present conflict, in some kind of historical context. I could argue it goes back decades earlier. I can't do that now, we don't have time. So I will just start with the most immediate. The generation who is currently fighting for their survival, who are being starved to death, and who are being bombed with some of the most insidious, sometimes experimental weapons. Clearly the Americans, the Saudis, and whoever else is involved are experimenting with certain kinds of weapons in this conflict. The people that are targeted are the ones who have proven to be the most resilient in face of this progressive expansion of Saudi influence in the larger world, using in particular Takfiri, what we call Salafist adventurism. And this is the people who we would find along the border of, which until year 2000 was actually an unmarked boundary between Yemen and Saudi Arabia. If you can see that orange part up along at the very top of what is northwest Yemen, this was an area that had historically always been, in a larger sense, that extends into the gray area, or Saudi Arabia, Yemeni territory. I mentioned in 1934, with the help of the British, Saudi Arabia reached what is more or less now the frontier between Yemen and Saudi Arabia and occupied that territory. And that territory, over the course of every 20 years, would be renegotiated. It was basically a temporary peace treaty between Yemen and Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia gave the right of the peoples who lived in this region to travel back and forth. Basically, there were no boundaries. And what that means is people with sheep who want to seasonally bring their animals to graze in other parts of this area were allowed to travel back and forth freely. It was also quite ideal because it was a great funnel for Saudi Arabia to import cheap labor, mostly coming from Africa, from Eastern Africa. This was an entry point to feed the high demand for cheap labor in the Gulf. And we're talking about construction workers, we're talking about service providers, we're talking about prostitution, we're talking about soldiers, police force. They're coming from Somalia, they're coming from Ethiopia, they're coming from Eritrea, from Sudan. And as you can see, Djibouti is literally, they're even considered at one point building a bridge between Djibouti and Yemen. This is how close Arabia is to Africa at this point. It was also an ideal point to smuggle in drugs, and there was lots of cross-border travel between Saudi Arabia and the larger Gulf and Yemen, and indeed Yemenis themselves provided cheap labor for much of the period up until 1990-91. So for a number of reasons, it was necessary for that boundary to remain open. There became a whole political economy around that border area. But at some point, it's an interesting link between what's happening in elsewhere in the world. While Europe is tearing down boundaries supposedly between countries, there, in other parts of the world you begin to see the pressure to actually police frontiers. This is exactly the same period when you start militarizing the frontiers between certain countries in Africa. And in 2000, BAF Systems was given a huge contract of some $20 billion to build and militarize the frontier between North Yemen and Saudi Arabia. And what happened basically is they shut that border down. They closed the economy off, and they criminalized what had been for 70 years a relationship of crossing freely back and forth, for at least for the local population. And that immediately caused conflict. And that basically initiated what was potentially just a very small dispute between the government in Yemen and its local population in Sada into an international conflict. A populist movement emerges around this Houthi, which becomes more or less a regional movement to address this problem on the border with Yemen and Saudi Arabia. And it's also something that's largely because of internally displaced people, large numbers of, say, uprooted people because of the transformations along the border, the militarization of the border, because of the long-term conflicts that had taken place inside Yemen, the civil war of 1993-94, the rise of new kind of global economy that had uprooted people from the countryside in this classic case of massive urbanization. Yemen was awaiting a time bomb for conflict, ideal for influence makers outside. And indeed, Yemen would be long the provider of able-bodied men to fight in Afghanistan. Much of the Mujahideen who fought the Soviets in Afghanistan were recruited through bin Laden, whose family is Yemeni, by the way, and were recruited from Yemen, trained in Yemen. And this association or relationship to uprooted population, the militarization of boundaries, the consequences to the policing of these boundaries, the limiting of possibilities for large numbers of Yemenis who at one point could work in the regional economy, led to this instability in this key area of the northwest. So this militarization of the frontier by 2000, the active encouragement from the West to settle this problem, for the Yemeni government to settle this problem through a series of wars, led to an ongoing conflict in this region with larger Yemeni government. And we can again go back to this problematic use of Houthis to simplify this conflict, where I would actually suggest that this actually extends well beyond it just being a small group loyal to a spiritual leader. It's a conflict that goes well beyond a simple region. It is in fact something that affects much of northern Yemen by 2000. This is a war that extends to 2009 with a heavy use of, by 2009, Saudi forces internally inside North Yemen. Yes.
I didn't grasp it. Maybe who were the, so to say, the powers, the interest who did mainly the militarization of borders? Was it Saudi Arabia, or was it people also in Sana?
Yeah, well, we must think that the government in Sana'a at various points in time have a conflicted relationship with Saudi Arabia.
Yes.
And at other times it becomes a subordinate of Saudi Arabia.
Yes.
It's a very lucrative relationship between certain families in Sana'a, in Yemen, with the larger oil industrial complex, the larger military industrial complex. The Ali Abdullah Saleh family, the General People's Congress, which is his political party, which, by the way, the president that is considered legitimate today, Hadi, is also part of, or was part of, made considerable amounts of money on the wars that it had internally, but also in the oil industrial development of oil and gas in Yemen from the 1990s onwards. So by 2000, when the Saleh regime in Sana'a, with Riyadh, with Americans basically serving as intermediaries, agreeing to actually militarize the border.
So
It was a joint project, yes.
Project.
Yes, where the beneficiaries in Sana'a and the beneficiaries in Riyadh would obviously go to war with those who are actually resisting this process. And the fact that large numbers of people, Yemenis, felt that their government was not representing their interests, was willing to sell sovereignty. They actually came to an agreement that had long been considered occupied Yemeni territories. In 2000, Saleh suddenly says, we will no longer make territorial claims to what used to be Yemen in southwest today, what we would call Saudi Arabia. So this constituted, in many ways, a breach of a long-established Yemeni claim that this is an occupied territory that we will agree to, for now, not have a conflict over. But when they signed this treaty in 2000, they literally delineate the boundary that extends all the way to the Omani border, which I can't... You can see that they actually draw a border. Before, there were no boundaries. It was basically called an empty quarter. And this is a huge problem because there's huge oil reserves in these desert areas. And as we saw with the war with Kuwait and Iraq, if you have questions about who has a right to access this underground, making him into a cartoon character and not appreciating what was going on internally in Washington, in New York, with these very different factions within American elite. And so it translated into Yemen into, much like with this whole coalition, it's a divided coalition. The people who are suffering are Yemenis. They are dying by the tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, every year. The situation on the ground is getting worse. There's no interest from the Human Rights Watch. You don't see any interest in the Red Cross or in the Médecins Sans Frontières. People have abandoned Yemen. Yemen is going to be there as an ongoing, quiet, forgotten war, much like what happened in Congo in the 1990s and 2000s, and millions of people in Yemen potentially are going to die. But at the same time, it's going to cost heavily, this imperialist mechanism that had long relied on petrodollar, on OPEC, on money flowing, circulating in the global economy in this way. Saudi Arabia as a tool is finished, I think, I'm hoping. Mm-hmm. And it's because of Yemenis. It's not because of any of us. We have done nothing for this struggle. Progressives in the West have gotten caught up in the word games and the tools being used by propagandists, and have lost track of actually understanding what is the fundamental basis of the struggle. And the irony is it's again Yemenis who are and Syrians who are at the forefront. Often people who have no ideological training, but they have a very instinctual kind of resistance to this. It's just right. It's just wrong what's happening to their societies. And I think we need to come back to that kind of equation as well.
It's very interesting what you say about this idea of exploiting the oil resources there and so on, and not caring about the population, because what you see is a genocide of the population to get rid of the population. It's a real British-style colonial mass starvation that's going on.
And I mean, those who are designing these policies, again, it's all based on contingency, because again, they assumed it would be a very easy operation. They did not think this war would last this long. A number of parties, maybe there may be some intelligence out there, I doubt it. I think, unfortunately, since the 2000s, American, British think tankers are so trapped in their own ideology, in their own racist kind of way of looking at the world, they can't think straight anymore. And they don't accept contrarian voices. They actually don't have debates anymore at RAND or in the Atlantic Council. They don't actually allow for opposition or different perspectives, so they actually don't understand how the world works. And this is why they're ultimately shooting themselves in the foot vis-a-vis Iran, vis-a-vis Russia, vis-a-vis Yemen. They just assumed with their own racist kind of ideas of how the world functions that they can just walk around and step on it anywhere, and they don't anticipate resistance in any organized way. But yeah, the resort now is to, we're just going to starve them in submission, but they don't understand Yemen then. And unfortunately, it's going to be then a war of who's going to last the longest. And I suggest that, unfortunately, a lot of Yemenis will die, but they will not submit to this project.
I have one question regarding exactly that. This alliance between the Ansarullah and the Saleh,
GPC, you mean?
GPC,
They never liked Saleh. They had a war, 7 wars with Saleh in the 2000s.
even the Ansarullah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but the GPC, I mean, he was ruling this. Is he perceived as a traitor also among his own? You think it was not Ansarullah who killed Saleh outside of Sana'a?
It could have been anybody, but in 2014, when Ansar Allah moved to say we have to bring back some law and order into the capital, this Hadi is selling off our country in ways that is unacceptable, had huge support from GPC, from the army, from the Yemeni army. And again, in our simplistic understanding of how these things work, the army is a private enterprise loyal to Saleh. Well, no, they think very independently. They're very educated guys in there. They very much have their own investments in notions of what Yemen and Yemen's interests are. And this is why they embraced this movement that moved into the capital. This is why they stood aside and didn't defend Hadi. No one wanted to defend Hadi. I mean, I had been in Yemen the last time in the early 2013, and it was a very violent place. There was lots of assassinations taking place. There were hits done on Yemeni soldiers by Islah-related forces. I mean, there were bombs where people were praying in mosques by suicide bombers. You'd never heard of suicide bombers before. Yemenis would never do that. So there was all this infiltration, and people were very upset by what had happened to Yemen. Now, they know also that Saleh is very powerful and influential. He had nasty business dealings with all kinds of players, many of whom immediately ended up in Saudi Arabia once the war started. Ali Musin and these people are just the most corrupt, evil types of them all. Stole billions of dollars of Yemeni's revenues over the years.
So, after his assassination by whoever, that didn't really weaken the Ansarullah movement or the resistance? That's my question.
Yeah, because again, Yemeni army, those who were in the Yemeni political party system, the GPC, which was the biggest party, are also Yemeni nationalists. And they were fighting a common enemy now, Saudi Arabia. And for the idea that their representative, their president, would actually start signing agreements with Saudi Arabia to end this war, it was unacceptable. And I say he did that because he knew that he actually had lost the loyalty of his most, because they had been fighting a war for almost 3 years now. And for a politician to say, well, let's go sign a treaty now with Saudi, let's end this war by making an agreement with Saudi Arabia, that's betrayal. And we see the results. There has not been a civil war even though they were hoping that there would be internal conflict.
Yes, exactly, because directly after the assassination in the West, and the press was hoping for the resistance to crumble. That
It didn't. It solidified. It got rid of these elements who exposed themselves to being, just waiting for the opportunity to take advantage again of throwing out this very powerful and popular movement. So unfortunately, we're at they keep throwing new assets. The Sudanese soldiers are not getting paid, they're now revolting, so they have to find new sources. You can't just keep this going. The Colombians have gone home, the very expensive mercenaries are gone now. The Americans will not fight this war anymore unless they get paid. So again, the Ponzi scheme, you gotta borrow hundreds of billions to pay for the 100 billion you've borrowed before, that pays for this month's payments of weapons. The moment that stops, the Americans stop supporting this war.
One thing, if they could use is the ISIS. I mean, because they could move these people out of Syria and Iraq into Yemen, and that could probably shift the balance, because that could be quite hard-nosed fighters. But have you seen anything about this?
Yeah, there have been movements. The problem is that it's being used against UAE assets. It's the war between UAE and Saudi that's taking place in that regard. There is not a unified front against the North Yemen anymore. I mean, they are fighting and bombing with planes, and Taiz is a divided city, but the real fight is over the oil assets and containing Aden, which is a horrible place to be right now.
That's where the ISIS are, in territories where the ISIS are presented, it's in that southern area. That's right.
Okay.
I'm sorry, it's a long-winded, I have a lot to say about this, but
1 hour became 2 hours, and that's because it was so interesting.
Yes.
I don't have a good command of time.